Good evening. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other tonight on country. I'm coming to you this evening from Gadigal land, where I live, work and write. I would like to pay my sincere respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be with us this evening. Welcome. My name is Rachel Franks and I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship at the State Library of New South Wales. It is a treat tonight, as it is every History Matters session, to bring to you on behalf of the Professional Historians Association of New South Wales and ACT and the Oral History Association of New South Wales, another episode of History Matters. Tonight it is all about biography. You'll be able to ask our speakers questions through the chat facility here in Zoom, and we'll get to those during the Q&A. I'm also pleased to be able to introduce your chair for this evening, Dr. Kylie Andrews. Kylie is a professional historian and she's also the current Secretary for Oral History New South Wales. Thanks so much, Kylie.
Hi. Hello, everybody. I would also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work here. I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders, past and present, and to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. On behalf of the Professional Historians Association and the Oral History Association of New South Wales, I want to thank Rachel and the State Library for hosting tonight's event. And I'd especially like to thank our contributors this evening, biographers Margo Beasley and Helen Ennis. The History Matters series focuses on public history and how it shapes our understanding of the past. In this forum, we're exploring issues that stimulate and bedevil the work of public historians. History Matters aims to encourage a more reflective approach to the practice of history. With that in mind, tonight's subject is Writing a Life, Reflections on Biography. So biography is one of the most enduring and popular forms of life writing. It attracts millions of readers and encompasses anything from celebrity gossip to books that rescue people from historical oblivion. Increasingly, new forms of biography and personal memory sources have emerged, and that further strengthens arguments that biography is the best way to write history. Our two presenters this month discuss the benefits and the challenges for biographers. Tonight, we'll be talking to Margo Beasley and Helen Ennis. We'll hear from Helen first and then Margo. And as Rachel said, we'll address your questions in the latter part of the session. So please post your questions through the Q&A function. So now I'd like to welcome Helen Ennis. Helen has extensive experience as a curator, a writer on Australian photography, and as a biographer. She's Emeritus Professor at the Centre for Art History and Art Theory at the ANU School of Art. And her most recent book is the biography Olive Cotton, A Life in Photography. By the way, this book has been shortlisted for the Australian Historical Association's Magarey Medal for biography. Helen.
Hello, thanks so much, Kylie. Now I'm coming to you from Ngambri Ngunnawal country because I live in Canberra, so I would also like to acknowledge the traditional ancestors here, but to pay my respects and to also acknowledge past, present and emerging Indigenous people, extending that to anyone who's listening tonight. So what I wanted to do, we're just going to talk for about 10 minutes each, and then it'll be great to open it up and have questions. So what I thought I would begin with is just saying a little bit about my subject, olive cotton, and then move to focus on one challenge in particular that I found when I was writing the biography and how I tried to resolve it. So Olive Cotton, hopefully you will know some of her photographs. She's now recognised as Australia's most important woman photographer. That certainly wasn't the case earlier in her lifetime. But she worked in the photographic industry in Sydney during the late 30s and into the 40s at Max Dupaine's studio, and probably a lot of you will have heard of Max Dupaine, who was far more famous, in fact, than she was. And then during the war, she ran his studio while he was away. She later had her own studio, and that was in the country town of Cowra in regional New South Wales. So that means she has a professional background, but for the purposes of my biography, it's her art photography that was central, because what it does is extend the language of modernist photography in Australia. Now, the time span for that then, there are two main periods, from 1934 to 1946, and then again from the mid-1980s onwards when she was rediscovered. This is when she had a one-person show in Sydney. So Olive was born in 1911, she died in 2003, and those dates are significant because it makes you realise straight away that her life and work span the 20th century and everything, in fact, that happened in that. She was the daughter of privilege. She came from an extraordinary family of luminaries. Her father was Professor of Geology at the University of Sydney. She had women in her family who did all sorts of consequential things. So she was really surrounded by people who wanted to make some kind of contribution to society and did so very effectively. She had an excellent education. She went to MLC. She played the piano. She was an outstanding student in English and so on. She went on to university, achieved a university degree. So she was in an environment that had very high expectations, in fact, for women. And the family's commitment to contributing to the social good. I think they all felt that you were on earth to do something useful. Now, the other crucial thing about the family, and this will come out in her work, you'll see that in her photographs, is this mixture then. They are incredibly committed to science and art at the same time. And so she draws from both of these streams in her family and is able to meld them into her practice. She's someone who knew her own mind and who was able to make independent decisions. And that's played out in her personal life because she married twice. The first time was to Max Dupaine, who we now recognise as the father, in fact, of modern photography in Australia. But she left him, and I think it was a huge shock. In fact, very soon after their marriage, she decided that it didn't suit her. You've got to remember that marriage then, people assumed it was going to be for life. There wasn't the option of a no-fault divorce that there is now. So she accepted that she would be disadvantaged by that decision, but she was sure that she should leave Max and proceed with a divorce. So I'm telling you details like that because they illuminate her individual choices and her circumstances. They show, I think, this commitment to act independently, to have autonomy. But they also provided some insights into her times in relation to the gender roles, views of marriage and divorce, but also in relation to work. So her second husband, Ross McInerney, whom she married at the end of 1945, was a farmer. Together they had 2 children, and they in 1946 moved to Cowra in New South Wales. That's where she spent the rest of her life. Her involvement in photography really dropped out of public view at that time, even though she kept taking photographs for her own purpose. So she wasn't rediscovered until the early 1980s, thanks to the efforts of feminist historians who are based in Melbourne. So that's just a very brief overview, but then why did I choose Olive Cotton as a biographical subject? Well, for me, the principal attraction was always her art photography because it is outstanding. And for me, there were underlying principles of egalitarianism, inclusiveness, the power of women, because her portraits of women are really exceptional, and her love of nature. So even if I say about egalitarianism, like how did that work? She was someone who was always interested in the interweavings between things. If she photographed flowers, it was often as a group rather than highlighting an individual blossom and so on. So all this came through her work. And then the photographs themselves, which I urge you to look at, they're admired for their beauty, their sensuousness, their serenity. And she was really incredibly masterful in her use of light and shade. But I'm also someone who's fascinated by the lives of creative women. And I had written a biography of another woman photographer, the European-born emigre, Margaret Michaelis, who worked at the same time as Olive. They were both in Sydney, in fact, even though they never met, but contemporaneously, there they were right in the heart of the city, both taking photographs on a professional basis. So I'm not going to go into any of that anymore, because what I decided I would focus on is one of the major challenges that I faced in writing Biography of Olive Cotton and how I ended up resolving it. So Olive, like many women, didn't have a conspicuous public profile until the 1980s. It's hard to find, you know, these public traces of her during the 30s and early 40s in terms of making public commentary about photography, for example, or any kind of commentary. She wasn't functioning in the public domain that way, even though her photographs were being circulated. So it wasn't until she was quite elderly that she had that public role. Now, curiously, in Olive's case, there also wasn't a lot of personal material, like diaries and letters, that would, you would hope, give an insight into her character and her inner life. And why biographers want these things so much is that they help then drive the biographical narrative forward. So I didn't have those. And that led to this question, okay, what can I bring into the space of biography to compensate for this lack of other more conventional material? How could I expand my evidence base? Now, fortunately, I had my own observations because I knew Olive over a long period of time and had often been in her home and in her company. I had her body of work, those wonderful photographs, which I've mentioned. And in the book, I discuss them both as groups and then singly. So some chapters are just a page or two, focusing on a particular photograph. And as well as the usual solid but not very interesting documentary evidence like birth certificates or marriage certificates and so on, and the small number of personal papers and letters, I decided then to also allow anecdote, gossip and rumour into my evidence base, so long as everything was verifiable, that someone had told me and maybe someone else had given confirmation that this observation or whatever was true. So in addition to that, I had something very unique, because Olive had actually, the houses where she had lived are still standing. Her family home in Hornsby, fabulous grand family home that just epitomised in fact her privilege. But where she lived in the country for more than 50 years on this property, Spring Forest with Ross, not only was the weatherboard cottage still there, but so were the two demountables, these construction workers' barracks, which she lived in with Ross from the 70s on till her death. So what was unusual is, okay, they were still standing, but at Spring Forest, the contents of her household was still there. Everything in the yard was still there, because after her death and Ross's death, that property wasn't sold, it was kept in the family. And that meant then that I had access to a very expanded archive, something that is in the real world in time and space, and a kind of range of other facts that I could consider. And they're important in my book, both as metaphor and as factual evidence. I wanted to note, though, that this different kind of factual base, I didn't write about all those different facts in the same way, because of course they demanded their own particular treatments. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. One was a legal document. When Olive was going through the divorce with Max, a stenographer comes to her studio where she is working, and she's presented, it's pretty compelling evidence, with £1 and given Max Dupain's family's address, so that there's no impediment, nothing that would stop her from returning to her husband to continue with his conjugal or their conjugal rights. So it's a document that things like that just speak for themselves. You don't need to elaborate on them because they're so revealing, not about only about the humiliation that she must have felt, but also about how divorce was conducted in those days. And then there were other things like the relationship, the very complex relationship between Olive and her second husband, where I do intervene and make more commentary because I have to base my comments on things that I have been told, maybe also observed. So different kinds of treatments according to the kind of factual material I had. So the other key thing for me in trying to find a solution was to combine my evidentially based research with a more creative literary approach. And what is essential to note there is it came both from non-fiction biography, but also from fiction. And I wasn't ever going to write fiction. I didn't bring a fictional narrative into that empty space I was telling you about, but there were things that I got from fiction that I'll elaborate on in a moment. So biography then, what could I take from biography and use in my process for writing this story of Olive Cotton, her life and work? So in fact, I try to lead readers through the different biographical processes, and they come from all manner of places. There are references to biographers like Virginia Woolf, Hermione Lee, Richard Holmes, whose book Footstepping, of course, is very lovely to read, Janet Malcolm, Robert Dessay, and so much more. But each of them had different things that I felt that I could put into my mix and use. One example in my book is the way that I describe Olive herself when I give the physical description, because I realised I'd written 150,000 words and I'd never even told the reader what she looked like, what it was like to be in her company, the fact that she was small, that her hairstyles were never elaborate, that she wore very little jewellery, you know, things that would reveal something about her. I had never even thought of describing that. So Virginia Woolf was indispensable there. Another example, Janet Malcolm, she says about biographers being like burglars, the way they break into people's houses and rifle through the drawers, you know, looking for all manner of personal items. And that became really the sensation that I myself experienced when I was looking at Max Dupaine's very private diary about his breakup with the marriage, of his marriage to Olive. Another strategy then was the oral dimension, because Robert Dessay, he actually goes to the house museum of his biographical subject, and he's listening, trying to hear what's in that environment. And all the times I had been to Spring Forest and the places where Olive had lived, I'd looked and looked, but I never listened. So these were things then I could bring in and help amplify the complexity then of her life, which wasn't available to me through the normal routes. So fiction then. Why is fiction even relevant to helping me address some of those issues? Well, my book is non-fiction, emphatically so, but fiction helped me gain an understanding of how to construct a biography as story. So narrative for me was the key there. I kept reminding myself that I was writing my story of Olive's life and work, not hers as such. I was the narrator. She wasn't the narrator. So the text, therefore, has what I see as a narrative arc. You know, it proceeds and hopefully gains momentum, is driven forward. And the figures in it, including Olive, she is my central character. I'm the narrator, and sometimes I am the participant. The complexity of that is something maybe we can come back to later. What fiction also gave me then was the possibility of poetry, of being able to write sometimes in a more lyrical or more open, freer manner than the straight non-fiction mode that I was also used to doing. It gave me pointers for style, structure, and way more. So in closing then, what I want to say is that in my view, a successful biography makes illuminating connections with our own lives and times. I don't think you just want to know about your subject and their times. You need them to reach across through time and space. And that's why you need the kinds of documents or the evidence that you have available to enliven it somehow so that you and I can make the connections with those subjects. What those connections are for you as a reader, I could never exactly say, but some of the themes that the book explores concern marriage, motherhood, creativity, ageing and mortality. But I know for me then, what Olive's legacy is the photographs, which gave rise to the biography in the first place, but also her belief in the value of a creative life. And I wanted to be able to match that in the way then that I approached the biography as a creative project. Thank you. So that's all I have to say for now.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was wonderful. Now I'd like to welcome Margo Beasley. Margo is an historian and a writer who has written several works of commissioned history. She has managed, collected and conducted numerous oral history projects, and she has a PhD in history from the University of Wollongong. Margo is currently researching the life of Dr. Eric Darke, Australian war hero, doctor and activist. Margo.
Thanks, Kylie, and hello everyone tonight. Thank you very much for tuning into our presentation, and thanks Helen for your talk about the lovely olive cotton. So I'll just give an outline of my subject, and then I will talk about issues that arise for me through this process, mainly the issues that a historian might, you know, take to the idea of biography. So my subject is Eric Peyton Darke. He is, or was rather, well known for being the husband of the once very famous Australian novelist Eleanor Darke. They're both now largely forgotten, but Eleanor has 3 biographies, whilst Eric has none, but he also has a claim to being written about because he had his own very interesting and engaged life. The two were linked, of course. There are brief accounts of his life in various places, and people have written about aspects of his life, but usually the two, you know, the things are not linked together. They're just about his rock climbing or about his medicine or about his political activities, but there's no single work that contextualises what he did and how it all fits into his life. He was born in 1889 into a conservative, very conservative Anglican family, but he lived for almost a century, mainly spanning the 20th century, a bit like olive cotton. He grew up in Sydney and Mittagong. I think his years in Mittagong were formative in the sense that he had at least 2 years there where he was allowed to run completely wild with his pony and his rifle. He didn't even most of the time have to do lessons. So he seems to remember that time in his life with great fondness. And when you see the trajectory of his life later on, you can see that there's probably a link between that period and how he developed as an adult man. He went to Sydney Grammar then, and then he studied medicine at Sydney University. And then he went off to World War I, having volunteered to serve with the British forces. There was a deal done with young Australian medical students that they could shorten their studying period by volunteering with the British forces. So that's what he did. He mainly took care of ambulance units, stretcher bearers and so on. And he served at the Somme and Passchendaele. He was wounded and decorated. And he returned to Sydney and married Kathleen Raymond, a woman with whom he had been in love for, passionately in love, I should say, for quite some years. They settled in Braidwood near Canberra, and he'd taken over a general practice there. And they had one son, John, but Kathleen died a few weeks after the birth of the baby, probably of septicemia. This was no doubt a traumatic event for all the obvious reasons, but he, within less than 2 years, he remarried, and he married Eleanor O'Reilly, and he had been a friend of her father. So he soon acquired a general practice in Katoomba, and the Darkes moved to Katoomba, and they settled there, and they remained there for the rest of their lives into the 1980s. They were both extremely closely identified with the town, and still are, because their house, Varuna, is now a centre for writers, a residential centre where people can come and stay and just work on their books. In the mountains, he became a leading rock climber, much praised by others who knew him as a very exacting teacher. And he was really a leader in that, the development of that sport, if you could call it that, in Australia. And he, the rock climbing and bushwalking he also did linked him very closely to the Australian landscape. And at the same time, his medical practice linked him very closely to the daily lives of people who lived in Katoomba. It was during the Depression of 1930s that he underwent a kind of political conversion, having been a very, more or less a Tory. He became a socialist after he was exposed to the deprivation experience by some of his patients during that time. And he began to write books about medicine and society and political issues of various kinds. He became an activist in the Labor Party and other left-wing causes, especially during and after World War II. He was closely associated with a number of Communist Party people. He was friends with them. Many people still believe that he was a member of the Communist Party, something he always denied, and I would say something that can never be really proven either way. Nevertheless, he was definitely a fellow traveller and very sympathetic to many of the causes espoused by the Australian Communist Party. As a result of that, he became a person of interest for ASIO and for right-wing groups in and around the Blue Mountains during the Cold War, after the end of World War II. There are a few sort of differing accounts, but about how those experiences affected him and Eleanor. But in the 1950s, they decided to buy a farm in Queensland where they went on to spend a lot of periods of time during the Katoomba winter, presumably to get the warmer weather, but also there's a theory that they were seeking to get away from the political climate in Katoomba and Sydney. He lived until 1987. The last few decades of his life were relatively quiet, although by 1960, when the Cold War was sort of weakening, he was already 70 years old, so it may just be that that was time to sort of wind down. He did have employment for quite a few years after that as a doctor who visited schools for the education department, which he apparently loved. It suited his political view of the world, but he was more or less forced into retirement when he became very old. I think he was in his 80s at that stage. He remained physically active and walked and played tennis into his 90s. And late in life, he was delighted to have been made a life member of the left-leaning Doctors Reform Society as a result of his lifetime commitment to the social aspects of medicine. So just to talk about a little bit, I'm aware we're relatively short of time, but to talk about biography. So I come to it as a historian, that's where all my training is and my thinking is. But as a historian, I've always been extremely interested in how the individual relates to the larger historical moment, which is something that's not necessarily easy to access in archival written records. I see history as a two-way process, as a kind of interaction between the individual and society, and it goes backwards and forwards. So the outside events go into the human being, who is already formed at some stage in their lives, and then they might also respond to things that are happening to their lives, and change in the individual might take place. It's one of the things I really like about oral history, that it's got the capacity to give some kind of an account of those sorts of two-way processes, rather than the big picture, broad brush accounts that necessarily make people small in the larger, more sweeping events of historical process. So in the case of Eric, he was born in the late 19th century, so Victorian, tail end of the Victorian period really, but he lived until the late 1980s. So the start of his life seems like long enough ago that it's kind of ancient history, or certainly, feels a bit like the remote past or remote past or sort of an unknowable place. But the end of his life was really quite recent by my terms for someone of my age, because it seems familiar and it's almost contemporary. So his life really embraced, in historical terms, you know, a really, really long period in Australian European history. So in his life, he didn't really experience great global events in a passive way. He actively engaged with them on all kinds of different levels at different times in his life. So he went off to the First World War with great enthusiasm. He was something of a Hun hater, if that's not a terrible word to use, but that was the expression he used, was the people don't realise about the Huns, I hate the Huns and so on. And but, you know, it was a pretty traumatic experience, his war experiences. I can't go into the details here, but they would have affected him very deeply in one way or another. He had his political conversion in the Depression, and it was that which shaped his life from then on. He responded to the Second World War in an extremely complex way. And his life, and as I have come to believe it, personal experiences and loyalties were all deeply challenged by the Second World War and the Cold War. So while he was doing all of this, he was mixing with cultural and political elites in Australia. He and Eleanor were friends with the Evitts. He worked for Chifley. You know, Jessie Street was another friend. They were in those sort of left-wing middle-class circles in Australia who were, you know, a bunch of very highly influential people. What is fairly unusual about him is the political conversion. Even though Eleanor had always been a Labor Party voter and had come from a kind of Labor tradition, he had always seen himself as a Tory. It wasn't a source of conflict in the marriage, apparently. But when he did become a left-leaning socialist, he was into his 40s, which effectively middle age. He was not halfway through his life at that stage, but by most people's reckoning, he was well and truly middle age, which is an unusual trajectory, and it's one that is sometimes happens the other direction. And indeed, people in his personal acquaintances, that happened. They went from left to right in the war and in the Cold War period. So the way he changed in the world, I think, is illustrative of what I'm trying to get at when I speak about biography, is how does all this stuff impact on him? How does one person change their mind? Really, why does one person change their mind in one way and another person change their mind in another direction? And in his case, what he did do was seek to just not accept the world, but to actually try and change it in some way, to actively try and have an impact on how the way the world worked. So that's a kind of a central question in my work on Eric Dark. But there is also another theme that's emerged during the time of that, is submerged theme, really, which is more about how Eric changed from being a colonial to an Australian. It's not something I've seen elucidated anywhere else, but I think there's probably a case for saying that his life and his views in some sense mimicked a kind of maturing of the Australian European population in relation to Great Britain. So when he went to the First World War, he still, and his contemporaries and friends and the people he wrote to, still called England home. That's clearly how they saw it. They're terribly kind of sentimental about it and so on. You can read through the letters. But by the end of his life, and really probably you could say by the Second World War, he had become an egalitarian Australian, very much in the mould of what we would see as a kind of classic Australian male, fair-minded, fair-thinking, egalitarian, seeking the best for all, and so on. So he sort of embodied the kind of increasingly nationalistic, independent view that progressive Australians were leaning towards and developing in Australian culture. So yeah, I guess it's what you try to do in an in-depth biography, unlike a popular biography that might be of a celebrity or a sports person or something. You would be there writing about just the kind of literal facts of their life and so on, not really relating it necessarily to the much broader or in-depth picture. But I think what Helen and I would both be trying to do in our biographies, or she's certainly already done it in hers, is to link that one human being to the broader social movements in which they found themselves, to situate them in what is a really big picture. And that makes the story of that one life far more important than just the story of the individual. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Margo. So we'll go straight to the questions. We've already started getting some, so please, everyone, bring your questions in. We'd love to hear them. I'll just start with the first question, one of the first questions that we received. Let's see. Okay, so this one I think we'll first give to Helen. From someone, do you have to like or even love your subject to write about them? What happens if along the way, Helen, the research, there's something that happens that makes you sort of feel a sense of disconnection, or you start disliking something about them? Can you still continue to write an insightful biography?
Look, I think that is such a great question, and I certainly have read, you know, in the various things that are written on biography, that it helps much more if you do know your subject well in that sense and like them. But in the first biography that I wrote on a photographer called Margaret Michaelis, I had a very complex and a really difficult relationship with her, and she led me up the garden path in all sorts of ways. I was kind of naive and gullible, and I took her at her word, and I realised that she was manipulating me and sort of toying with me in a way. But I respected her enormously because of her work, but also what she'd been through. She was someone who was Jewish, who'd fled she'd gone from Austria to Berlin, then she had to flee Berlin. She was on the left, you know, an activist. She'd gone to Spain, there was Spanish Civil War, and she'd ended up eventually in Australia, but she'd had so many traumatic things happening. She told me about her husband, this great love that they had, and then when I found in the archives that they'd divorced even when they were in Spain, rather than her spinning me this narrative about him coming to join her in Australia and everything, and realising that was absolutely impossible. It put me in this awkward situation, difficult situation with my biographical subject. So in the end, you know, I just accepted it. I decided I would make no judgments about people lying to me or misrepresenting their histories. I just tried to accept that lives are complex, and there were very good reasons for her behaving with me the way that she did. And so we might never have been close personally, but, you know, we had come to some sort of agreement, and I was fascinated by her. Now, the same thing with Olive. There were things in Olive's life which I found incomprehensible in terms of decisions that she'd made. They were so obviously not in her interests, but I tried not to be judgmental, just to make a woman's life far more complex, you know, far more larger, more expansive, huger than we might think, rather than being reductive. So that's how I've tried to deal, I suppose, with those difficulties then, where you might not absolutely adore everything about your subject.
And Margo, what about you? How did you find that similar journey when you were looking into Eric's life? And were there any moments that really jarred for you? Or
no, I think I really do like him. I never met him, but I think more broadly, I'd say it's probably not really strictly necessary to like the person, but you have to be really interested in them, because there are a lot of people, I suppose all of us, very paradoxical. There are always going to be things that you don't like about a person, or that you wish they hadn't done or said. But that's only if you're viewing them in a two-dimensional way. I mean, there's always got to be some things wrong with them, and yeah, I think, no, curiosity, I think, is probably a more important way to approach it.
So how did you, Margo's, one of the questions is sort of how did you start with Eric's story? How did you discover him? And then what was it about him that made you want to take it further?
Well, I knew about him because of Eleanor. I live in the mountains and I've had an association with Varuna. Somebody else I knew, a friend, had been interested in writing a biography of him at some stage, which had also piqued my interest. The friend hadn't got to that work. So I wrote to him and said, I'm interested, but I won't proceed if you're intending to continue. But he said, no, that was okay for me to go ahead. So that was good. I also I was interested in finding a subject who was from the Blue Mountains, because we'd moved up here, and I wanted something that would sort of introduce me to the sort of physicality of the place. And Eric's perfect for that because of all his rock climbing and bushwalking and so on. And that takes me to all sorts of places I would never have even been able to register on a map. Not that I can climb the way he did. I can't climb at all. But yeah, so there were other sorts of reasons. But by and large, I think, you know, just an attractive personality.
Okay. I've got a question, an oral history question for both of you. For both of you, I'll start with Helen. Did either of your subjects have official or sort of, you know, formal oral histories recorded? But when the second question I want to ask is, when you were doing your own interviews of people, either living or friends or family, just if you could just very briefly summarise the approach that you took, whether it was very targeted, where you had specific information you needed to know, or was it more a formal oral history where you let people just ramble and let the thought play out? So Helen, if I could ask you first about that.
Look, oral histories for me were fantastic. Not only did Olive Cotton do 2 late in life, but people in her circle like Max Dupain obviously had as well. For me, do you know, one of the biggest thrills about oral history now is how many are digitised, how many of those interviews you can go online and in your own living room or bedroom, wherever you listen, you can have your subject, you know, right there with you. So the immediacy of the voice, I think, is crucial, as well as the content, of course, what it is that they talk about. So yes, for me, the oral histories that had been recorded online, State Library of New South Wales, National Library, invaluable. But the way that I did my interviews, in fact, you know, I hardly recorded any. Because my project was of such a personal nature, because I knew Olive and her husband Ross and had been visiting them since the mid-1980s, most of the time what would happen is if we had a discussion, I would then go out, like even if I left their place, pull over in the car and write down everything that I remembered. So that's how I tried to deal with stuff, because if I had turned on a recorder, it would have changed our whole dynamic, and I wasn't prepared to do that. So I just actually did a lot of memory work where I would talk with people and then immediately go and note it down, but then run it by them before it was published. So in the case of my biography of Olive Cotton, there's such a lot of personal material there. And of course, the family, through the daughter especially, who I worked with so closely, Sally McInerney, she was able to let me know if things were too difficult or not too difficult to be published.
Right. Margo, how about you? Oh, you've muted.
No, I'm right now. I temporarily lost my internet connection. So can you quickly summarise the question?
Oh yeah. So firstly, was there oral history already existing of Eric Darke, and had anyone officially put something in at the State Library or National Archives or whatever? And then also the second question was, when you, if and when you did your own oral history interviews, what approach did you take? Were they very directed, where you had specific gaps in the historical landscape that you needed to fill, or was it more a formal oral history where you sort of let them talk and followed it as it went on its journey?
Okay, yeah, so there are existing oral histories. Some of them are, quite a few in the Blue Mountains library local studies collection that were very helpful. They were done quite late in his life, which, you know, it's a problem. Getting, you know, somebody in their 90s is getting pretty frail, even if their memory is good. And he was obviously very weary at different times. Nevertheless, they were done. There's one very long one done. It's in the National Library, and there are a few bits and pieces around the place. There are also interviews with other people who knew him, mainly in the Blue Mountains City Library collection. I have done a few interviews. I would say they probably don't count as oral history in the sense that I have no intention of archiving them in any way. They're just extremely informal, and I do them on my phone because it's completely unobtrusive. And people don't get intimidated by a phone, but they certainly get intimidated by a high quality recorder. So I hope that answers the question. So they're interviews, so yeah, occasionally targeted, but really it's the chat is where everything comes out rather than the specific questions that makes things work.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got some more, we've got quite a few. Thank you everyone for your questions. A few people, we're getting questions about both the sounds of their voices and being able to hear or speak to them, but also the photography and how that gives you that extra dimension in the way of analysing their lives. So their body of work, but also their physicality and their expression. So would either of you like to talk about something that really struck you as you were writing these biographies, or those sort of extra components that are sort of more unusual in the way to get to know the people?
You go first, Margo.
Oh, well, actually, I was just going to introduce one other sort of slightly different thing, that a lot of what's on record about Eric, I mean, there are public photographs and so on, nothing as relevant as Olive's photograph. But a lot of what's on the record about him is actually in relationship to Eleanor. But what emerged in the State Library collection, thank you to the State Library, is the letters that his first wife wrote to him when he was away at the war. They haven't really been written out. I have an article in the SL magazine late last year about them, because they showed me in a completely other dimension that before Eleanor, because his life before Eleanor is not really taken all that seriously, because Eleanor's the main game. Understandably, she was the sort of creative, she had the creative brilliance. But yes, it was these extremely emotional and personal letters that made me understand him in a very different light, and information that was put there by the son of his first marriage. So yeah, so that did add a whole other voice to the whole picture.
Well, I think this question about the embodied experience, you know, for us to be able to go to the places where our subjects lived and worked, to be able to hear their voices, and that if they have died, but we have that access through oral history, it's really important, because it can help you with your writing style. Because what I decided with Olive Cotton is that I wanted to write in a way that was in accord with her photographs. So her photographs actually have the serenity that I mentioned. They're sort of uncluttered and refined. And I felt that it was important that I wrote in a way that meshed with her particular style. But also because I knew her and I knew the way that she conducted conversations, and I liked her so much. This is over, you know, many years, nearly 20 years. She never would overspeak, you know, you or interrupt you. She always left this huge conversational space, and she spoke so respectfully and quietly, incredibly well enunciated. And again, that was something that I thought that I would use in my approach to the way I wrote, that I wouldn't rush to, you know, make decisions or to, she just wasn't like that. She just wasn't opinionated. So I've tried in the way that I've written this book, because I think every biographical subject calls for you to be sympathetic to something about them. You've got to sort of adapt to what it is that's essential to them. So that meant my language is quite straightforward. I tried not to use really long sentences or a lot of really complicated words. I wanted to have that refinement, and I thought elegance that I responded to in her and the way she spoke.
Okay. We've got a few more quick questions. We've got a few minutes. One question is, both of you, I mean, sources are a very important part of both of the areas that you're talking about, but a question about the personal papers for Margo. Is there a cache of personal papers accessible that you found? Were they in the library, were they at Varuna, or in the ASIO files, I'm guessing, which would have been in the National Archives in Canberra? That was a question in regard to that one.
Well, yes, for Eric, the main cache of material is in the State Library of New South Wales. And it's sort of linked to Eleanor's material, a lot of which, you know, her letters are quite often about Eric, so there's that element as well. There is still some material at Varuna, which I think is in the stage of being organised to go probably to the State Library, so it's been nice to be able to access some of that, and a lot of that is letters that Eleanor wrote to her stepmother, but she talks about Eric in those letters and gives another sort of insight into him. And there's some material at the National Library, but not so much.
Okay, and what was one of your, this is just a random one, but what was one of the, you know, we all have the surprises that we find that would just thrill us when we find something in our archives. What can you remember any that really struck you that was like treasure?
I think the chief treasure was Eric's letter to his son after Kathleen, his first wife, died. So he wrote it to his son when the son was only a few months old, and then it appears in another version many years later, but another very similar version. And it was the most surprisingly emotional and touching thing about the beautiful young woman that it put his marriage to Eleanor in a completely different light, because that's seen as the great love story, but really was the second love story. Yeah, so that was lovely, beautifully written, beautifully expressed, and extremely emotional. And, you know, written just very shortly after she died.
Yeah. And Helen, for you?
Yeah, look, one of the things I found was so tiny, but it was just really fantastic. In a letter Olive wrote to Ross, her second husband, she said how she was buying a present for Damien Power's son who had been born. Now, Damien Power is the famous filmmaker who got killed in Papua New Guinea, but who had filmed in Papua New Guinea, was killed in the war. But his son had been born after he died, so Olive had bought a present. She'd written a little card, and then when I was in the State Library of New South Wales and I'm going through the Damien Power papers, the card was there, and I just felt that's one of those things, suddenly you're transported back decades, you know. That's why with archives we've got to realise it's not always the grand, you know, very super important documents, but sometimes those little ephemeral, almost intangible thing, they have this kind of intangible worth, and that was something that transported me. But you know, when I have done footstepping research, which is where you do go to places, often I'm very disappointed. I don't have an epiphany, something doesn't happen. With Margaret Michaelis, it only, I think, ever happened once in Barcelona. I was in the street where she had lived, and I went over to the park. I was so disappointed. I looked at the apartment, you know, nothing was going on. And then there was a big olive tree in the corner of the park, and I touched it, and I suddenly thought, you know what, that tree would have been there when she was 100 years old. She might have touched it too. And suddenly I had that sense of communion. So you never know where it's going to come from or what the experience will be that will trigger some kind of insight or feeling.
Okay. Rachel, I'm not sure how much more time. Can we take a few more questions, or should we start wrapping it up? Because I do have a couple of questions about, for Margo, about writing, a woman writing a biography of a man and things like that, but it depends on how much time we've got.
We probably have time for one more question.
All right, one more quick one, which is, and I'm I'm writing biographies of women, so I don't have this dilemma right at the moment, but wondering, Margo, about writing a biography of a man as a woman, getting into that mindset or thinking about that, you know, such wonderful things that we're writing from a feminist perspective, but writing of a man's perspective. Anything in particular that you found challenging?
Look, I think it's quite possible to write a feminist biography of a man. A feminist biography is one that privileges things differently to the way that what we might call a masculinist biography does. So I think the way I understand it, it doesn't necessarily follow the same arc. It's not about grand achievements. It's about daily life and interpersonal relationships. And there may be a long period at the end, as there was in Eric's life and Olive's too, where really not a great deal happened in a public way. Nevertheless, that life was lived. So, yeah, I think it's a matter of approach. It's not really a matter of whether the subject is male or female.
Okay, wonderful. Well, that's all we have time for, I think. Thank you both, Helen and Margo, so much for sharing your journeys with us. History Matters events take place on the first Wednesday of every month. Our next session is on Wednesday, the 5th of August, and that is Crime Histories and the Australian Story. What are some of the ways that public historians can engage with the importance of crime, and how we can contextualise it for a variety of audiences? So how should crime be presented to the public? And that's with Nerida Campbell, who's the curator of the Crime and Justice Museum, and Andy Kaladelphos, who will speak to us about the prosecution project. And then after that, I think the Professional Historians Association and the History Council of New South Wales are co-hosting an event, History as a Career. And that'll be next week on the 7th of July, Tuesday, at 5:30. And that's on careers in museums and archives. And that'll be featuring Alinda Beerhuizen and Bonnie Wildey. So finally, I'd like to once again thank the State Library of New South Wales for being our hosts, for Rachel Franks and Jade McLaughlin, and we hope to see you all again next time. And so now I'll send you back to Rachel.
Thanks, Kylie. Thank you, everybody, for coming, for participating, and for joining us this evening. If you would like even more stuff at home this evening, the next instalment of the library's Talking Deadly series starts tonight at 7 p.m. Travis de Vries will be talking to Deborah Taylor about First Nations artistic responses to the anniversary of the arrival of Cook here in New South Wales. And also, if you would like some more history, next Tuesday, the 7th of July at 11 a.m, Mark Dunn from the Professional Historians Association will be talking about his new book, Convict Valley, as part of the library's Scholar Talk series. Until then, stay safe, everybody, and thank you for coming. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thanks very much.